Again, as you know, there are several minhagim. I want to go over a little more detail what the source of the minhagim are. Basically, there are 4 minhagim. There's actually 7, but there are 4 that are somewhat widely practiced today. Minhag number 1 is that we start the Avelis the second day of Pesach, meaning no haircuts, etc., and we go up until Ashvardim go through Lag BaOmer, and they allow everything only after Lag BaOmer. That's the minhag of Rav Yosef Karo, that Lag BaOmer does not have any special heter. That's the only minhag that says you go 33 full days, and everything is mutter only from Lag BaOmer, day 34. That's the minhag of many Svardim. Many Svardim actually don't follow that anymore. Then we have minhag number 2, which is the Ramaz minhag, in which he says you start the second day of Pesach and you go until Lag BaOmer, and Lag BaOmer onwards, everything is permitted. Onwards, everything is permitted. That's minhag number 2. Minhag number 3 is you do not observe the mourning restrictions at all for the month of Nisan, because Nisan is a festive, happy month, and you begin the mourning restrictions from the first day of Rosh Chodesh Iyar. Lag BaOmer in the middle is a hiatus. Then you resume after Lag BaOmer, and you go up until the 3rd day of Sivan, which is called Shlosha Shemei Hagbala, because the Torah was given on the 6th. So 3, 4, 5 are called the 3 days of preparation for Matan Torah. So you're allowed to get married the 3rd and get haircuts the 3rd day of Sivan, and Lag BaOmer is a hiatus. The 4th minhag is you start after Rosh Chodesh Iyar, so you're missing 2 days, and you go until the 5th of Sivan with Lag BaOmer as a hiatus, right? Those are the different minhagim of Avelis. Now again, it's very important that you don't confuse, I mean this is an obvious point, but people sometimes get confused. You don't confuse Avelis with the counting of the Omer. The counting of the Omer is, of course, 49 days, but the Avelis is only 33 days, because the students of Rabbi Akiva died only during a 33-day period. Now the last minhag is the minhag of the Arizal, that you keep all 49 days. I assume you don't want to go in that direction, but the Arizal says you keep everything until, Erev Shavuos, right before Yom Tov, you're allowed to get a haircut and the like. Right, so these are different minhagim. Now it's very, very interesting that Rav Moshe Feinstein has 2 interesting tshuvas. I think I may have told you one, I don't remember, but I'll say both of them so you'll have them together. Tshuva number 1, which I think I may have told you, is that let's say you're invited to a wedding which is during your Avelos period, but it's not the Avelos period of the Chassan and the Kala. For example, let us assume that you begin your Avelos right after Pesach, and you go from the second day of Pesach to Lag BaOmer. And the Chassan who's getting married doesn't start until Rosh Chodesh, so he invites you to his wedding right after Pesach. Or vice versa. Let's assume the Chassan keeps from the second day of Pesach to Lag BaOmer, and everything is mutter after Lag BaOmer, but you keep from Rosh Chodesh, or even after Rosh Chodesh, and you're forbidden. Now, Lag BaOmer is a hiatus like everybody, except Rav Yosef Kairo's Shita. But the person's getting married after Lag BaOmer, and for you, this is still a Sfira period, right? So what do you do, right? It's very, very common. You're invited to a chasna, which is during the period of time in which your minhag is to observe Avelis. So Rav Moshe Feinstein is Mechadesh, a very, very interesting Chiddush, that there is no prohibition to go to a wedding during Sfira. The only prohibition is to get married during Sfira. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Shulchan Aruch says, you don't get married during Sfira. Well, if I'm invited to your wedding, I'm not getting married, I'm just going to your wedding. So Rav Moshe says, as long as the chassan is allowed to get married, in other words, if it's a non-religious wedding that they're getting married when they're clearly not allowed to get married, for example, between now and Lag BaOmer is for sure a mourning period like all the minhagim, then you wouldn't have a heter. But assuming that the chassan is legitimately getting married, you are allowed to go even though it's your mourning period. Right, so that's a very, very interesting chiddush, and it's very logical because, once again, contrast the laws of Omer with the laws of Avelis, the laws of mourning over a parent. When it comes to the laws of mourning over a parent, the halacha is you're not allowed to go to a simcha. Right, we'll have heterim for parents to children. There are many heterim even then, but the halacha is expressed in terms of not going to a Beis HaMishta, not going to a party, not going to a festive gathering. So as a result, if God forbid somebody is a mourner for their father or for their mother, and they're invited to a wedding, so you have to ask a shaila, what do you do? Again, I'm not going to get into this now. You can work, you can set up chairs, you can take pictures. How does it work if it's your own child getting married? Okay, in other words, there are shailas. I'm not going to answer the shailas right now. There are shailas because in Hilchos Avelos, the prohibition is in terms of going to a Beis HaMishta, a party. Masha'enken by Sfiras Omer, it does not say there's an isser to go to a Beis HaMishta. It says there's an isser to get married. So Rav Moshe says, I'm not getting married. You're inviting me to your wedding. I can go to your wedding. Fine. Now, the only question is, okay, so there's no problem of my going to a wedding. Got you. But the problem is, if the minhag is that we don't listen to live music during Sfira, especially if it's dance music or Lebedik music, so the question is, okay, there's no issue in my going to the wedding, but how can I go to the wedding if there's going to be live dancing music and the like? So there Rav Moshe says that once you're allowed to go to the wedding, it now becomes a mitzvah. Once it's a mitzvah, then the issur of listening to music during Sfira is not going to apply because this is a simcha that is a mitzvah, so you're even allowed to listen to music. It's not clear to me if Rav Moshe would even allow you to dance, but I think the logic of his tshuva would be you, even though you're in mourning, would even be allowed to dance because that's the mitzvah of simchas chasen v'kala. And finally, Rav Moshe says, you would be allowed to take a haircut if you were a little unkempt, because since you're going to honor the chassan and the kala, so you shouldn't go in a state that you don't look so good. So very, very interesting that you are allowed during your avelis, to go to the wedding, to hear the music, possibly dance, that I'm going to leave open, and you clearly are allowed to get a haircut, and the reason is because the core avera of not getting married is only not getting married. It is not an isser to be nichnas lebeis hamishta, unlike an avel for a parent, or even not a parent during 30 days. A parent, the avelis is a year. For a brother or sister, for example, it would only be 30 days. But nevertheless, that's important, meaning, you see, you have to be very careful of labels. We talk about Svira as having laws of Avelus, but not really. I mean, the laws of Avelus are different than the laws of Svira, and you can't automatically just apply the laws of Avelus. It's a different concept. Yeah.
If you're not permitted to, if you are permitted to go to a wedding, if you're invited to one,
yeah.
How is one able to have a wedding in the first place?
Oh, no, that's a good point. The reason why someone was allowed to have a wedding was because for them, the mourning period had expired already. That would be the issue. Now, Ein Achinami, Rav Moshe seems to say that if you had a non-religious couple who were simply, even if it was a kosher wedding, who were getting married during the Avelis of the Omer, you wouldn't be able to say, oh, I can go because I'm not getting married, because you would be going to a prohibited wedding. But as long as the wedding is permitted for them, it is permitted for you to go. That's Rav Moshe's chiddush. It is very, very logical, but I have to be honest, many poskim are cholek and Rav Moshe. In fact, it's mashma the Chassam Sofer, who was much earlier, is cholek in this, and the Chassam Sofer is mashma that during your mourning period, you're not allowed to go to a wedding. But as I say, certainly if it's a good friend who's getting married, you could be somech on Rav Moshe's psak l'kula. Now, we then come to a second question that Rav Moshe deals with, which is not the same as the first question. And that is, can I switch from minhag to minhag, meaning to say the following? Now, if my only issue is I want to go to your wedding, I don't have to switch because I can keep my minhag and go to your wedding, right? So that's not relevant. But let's assume I myself got engaged, right? Let's assume the following example. I normally keep Svira from Rosh Chodesh through 3 days of Hagbala, except for Lag BaOmer. Okay? But I get engaged. And Lag BaOmer is booked. I can't get a wedding hall for Lag BaOmer. But I can get a wedding hall the day after, or a week after Lag BaOmer. Problem is that for me, I keep Svira during that period of time. So am I allowed to switch my minhag the year that I'm getting engaged and basically say, oh, I'll start from the second day of Pesach? Now, the one thing you can't do is, this is important, you can never kind of take the leniencies of both. Let's say a person says, oh, this year I'll keep Svira from Rosh Chodesh Iyar until Lag BaOmer and then stop. Can't do that. You either start second day of Pesach till Lag BaOmer, or you start Rosh Chodesh till Shlosha Shemei Hagbala, or after Rosh Chodesh until Erev Shavuos. You can't, as it were, just pick the kulos of both, right? It's not like, I'll go with the leniency of not starting till Rosh Chodesh and the leniency of stopping after Lag BaOmer. So that's not a question. Nobody's saying you can do that. But the question is, assuming I will keep a legitimate minhag, meaning if I normally start Rosh Chodesh, which would prohibit me after Lag BaOmer, could I this year say I'm going to start second day of Pesach and be permitted after Lag BaOmer? And can I do this 1,000,000 times? Is it only one time you can do it? Can I do it every year? Just as a matter, this year it works out better, and this year it works out better, and the like. So there are opinions. Again, it's a machlokas, but there are opinions that say, as long as you keep 33 days of mourning, you can do whatever you want any year. In other words, you can go from year to year to year to year, constantly switching. It makes no difference. The only minhag that you'd be stuck with is if you followed the Arizal and you kept 49 days, then you wouldn't be permitted to go lenient into 33. But any 33-day combination is going to be all right. That is one shita. A second shita goes the opposite and says, any minhag you have been following becomes equivalent to a vow. We know that when you do a mitzvah enough times, 3 times, it becomes like a vow. And for you to switch would require going through the ceremony of hataras nidarim. That is the annulment of vows. Now, we do it Erev Rosh Hashanah, or Erev Yom Kippur, some people do it, but you can do it any day of the year if you have a vow. And essentially what this means is you declare in front of a beis din of 3 people. They don't have to be rabbis, but they have to be religious people, and they have to be people who understand the concept of a vow. And they sit, they sit and you stand, and you say, I engaged in a practice that I think may have become a vow, but I hereby declare that I regret that it ever became a vow, because had I known I would be getting married, let's say after Lag BaOmer, I never would have made this vow, and they will release you from the vow. Mutar lach, mutar lach, mutar lach. In fact, when you do this, you don't need to recite the whole long thing that's in the Cedar or the Machzor. You just say exactly what I just said. The way I said it is all you have to say in English. And the beis din just announces, mutar lach, mutar lach, mutar lach. So according to Shita number 1, you can switch freely, no problem at all. According to Shita number 2, whatever minhag you have been following becomes a neder, and you have to have hataras nidarim. But then we have Shita number 3, which is Rav Moshe Feinstein's Shita, and this is very, very intriguing. He differentiates between minhag 1 and 2, which I'll explain, and minhag 3 and 4. Okay, so again, to remind you, minhag 1 is the mechaber shita that you got to go through Lag BaOmer, and you're only allowed to get married from the 34th day of the Omer. Minhag 2 is virtually the same, except we ended one day earlier. You go from second day of Pesach up to, and not including Lag BaOmer, right? So that's 1, 2. So 1, 2 starts second day of Pesach, and either goes through Lag BaOmer or up to Lag BaOmer. 3 and 4, Minhag 3 is starting Rosh Chodesh, going until Gimel Sivan, and Minhag 4 is starting after Rosh Chodesh and going to Erev Shavuos. And both of those cases are with Lag BaOmer as a break. Okay? Minhag 5 is the Arizal. We're not going to talk about that because that you would need Hataras Nedarim for sure if you want to leave. Here is what Rav Moshe says. Minhag 1 and 2 is based on when the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva actually died. In other words, the first minhag and the second minhag take the position that the students of Rabbi Akiva died from the second day of Pesach, either through Lag BaOmer, or the second day of Pesach up to Lag BaOmer. In other words, the first two minhagim are based on a determination when the students of Rabbi Akiva died. The second group of minhagim, 3 and 4, is simply saying, we know they died for 33 days, so we got to pick a 33-day time frame in which we mourn. So Rav Moshe says, if your minhag is simply based on picking 33 days, you can go from one to another. So Rav Moshe says, you can absolutely go from 3 to 4 or 4 to 3 without Hataras Nedarim. So an example would be, let's assume I normally start my Avelis Rosh Chodesh Iyar. But this year I'm engaged, and the best time for me to get married is Rosh Chodesh Iyar. So I could say, this year, instead of Rosh Chodesh until the Gimel Sivan, I'll go from after Rosh Chodesh to Erev Shavuos, and vice versa. Because minhag 3 and 4 are the same minhag. It is not based on when the students of Rabbi Akiva actually died. It's simply based on the fact that they did die over 33 days. We don't know exactly which 33 days, so different communities picked a different group of 33 days. So Rav Moshe says the following. When you follow the first minhag, first or the second minhag, you cannot switch to 3 and 4. Because you accepted a minhag, unless you have Hataras Nedarim, because you accepted a minhag that commemorates what is allegedly the actual day of their death. And you can't switch to something that's based on an approximation. So according to Rav Moshe, if you normally started the second day of Pesach, but you want to get married Rosh Chodesh Iyar, you would not be able to switch unless, and this is not so clear, Rav Moshe doesn't say it, unless you do Hataras Nedarim, because you're switching from a minhag based on exact date to a minhag based on just picking a 33-day period. And it would also seem that you couldn't go from the Rosh Chodesh minhag to the second day of Pesach without Hataras Nedarim, because you're switching from approximation to exact. So within the minhagim that are only based on approximation, you are allowed to go back and forth without Hataras Nedarim, but you would not be able to move from the exact date to the approximation or from the approximation to the exact date. Now, this is a very interesting and a bit of an intricate tshuva, but as I say, most of the time it's not relevant because of Rav Moshe's other tshuva. Because people ask the wrong question. Typically, people go to a Rav and they say, I keep Avelos from Rosh Chodesh till Shloshim Me'agbala, but I was invited to a wedding. Am I allowed to switch my minhag? That is the question that a rabbi gets all the time. But the answer to that is, again, according to Rav Moshe, you don't have to switch your minhag. You can go with your minhag to the wedding. So 9 out of 10 times when people want to switch minhagim, it's something they don't have to do at all because they want to go to a wedding. The only time you'll need Rav Moshe's lumdus about switching minhagim is if you're actually getting married that year, and hopefully that's not going to be a year-to-year type of sometimes, but Be'ezras Hashem, that'll only be a one-time decision. and therefore you're not going to have to go back and forth on all of those issues. Okay, so these are two different shuvas of Rav Moshe. Do not confuse them. One is the general heter to go to a wedding during your Avelis period. The other is the more complicated issue of switching from minhag to minhag. Yeah.
According to his tshuva, someone with minhag 3 or 4 could go to 1 or 2 because it just has to be a general 33-day period. It doesn't matter.
That I have to tell you the truth. That's a little uncertain. In other words, you're raising a good question. Why can't I accept minhag 1 or 2 as just my 33 days? So Moshe seems to say that there was no minhag that went with that cheshbon because the minhag of 1 and 2 was only based exclusively on there being the actual days of death. So you can't kind of make up your minhag and say, I'm doing this, but I'm doing it for a different reason than the minhag was established. So it seems that once you go to 1 or 2, you're now kind of frozen in that minhag, and you will not be able to switch. Yeah.
Does Omer just
Yeah.
Does Omer just comfortably coincide with the time that the Rabbi Akiva's Talmud and
So again, it all depends. Like the first minhag that the Ramah brings, that I called minhag number 2, that the mourning stops on Lag BaOmer. There are two interpretations actually. Either they actually did die on Lag BaOmer, but the last day of mourning, we always say all you need is Mikzas Hayom. Meaning there are two ways of learning the Ramah. Does the Ramah mean they didn't die on Lag BaOmer? Or does the Ramah mean they did die on Lag BaOmer, but the last day of any mourning period, I say Mikzas Hayom Kekulo. That's a machlokas in the Ramah. Now, the other minhagim, where Lag BaOmer is a hiatus, that clearly is making the claim that miraculously Talmidim stopped dying on that day, even if they continue to die afterwards. In other words, this is an interesting paradox that may be a little hard to get. You would think that the shita that stops on Lag BaOmer is making Lag BaOmer kind of a real special day. But in reality, the shita that stops on Lag BaOmer perhaps maintains they died on Lag BaOmer, but it's Mikzas Hayom Kekulo on the last day of Avelis. It's bedafka the other minhagim, minhag 3 and 4, where Lag BaOmer is not the end of the morning, that behechrich Lag BaOmer was a miraculous day in which the Magefa stopped. We will talk when we get closer to Lag BaOmer, because this is going to be a very important idea. What was so special about Lag BaOmer that the students of Rabbi Akiva either stopped dying legamri at that point, or even if they continued dying, but on Lag BaOmer bedafka, there was a cessation of the Magefa. Right? Obviously, there is something special about Lag BaOmer. Now, granted, we'll talk about closer to Lag BaOmer. As all of you remember, last year in Meron there was a great tragedy. B'ezras Hashem, things should be much better this year. Again, they want people. They didn't shut down Meron, right? There was some talk about just shutting it down. They want people to come, and hopefully there'll be greater shmir and greater protection. But the history of the massive celebrations in Meron is very interesting. Some say they are very recent. That even 100 years ago, you'd go to Meron. Maybe of course there were much fewer Jews in Israel. You go to Meron, and there would be 20 people there. What do they say about Meron? They say about Meron that it's so crowded that even Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai leaves town on Lag BaOmer. So he's not even there on Lag BaOmer. So the truth of the matter is, putting safety aside, Meron is it's not next door. It's not the easiest place to go to. But if you go to Meron during the year, you have Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai almost all to yourself. A wonderful thing. You can go to the kever. You could stay there for 3 hours. There are other people there, but it's right there. So one might think that maybe Lag BaOmer is not the best day necessarily to go to Meron. I will tell you that even the most Litvisha Gedolim who are not into Kivrei Tzadikim, they're not into praying at graves, they do find something special about Meron. The Brisker Rav, who was as Litvak as you could get, more than his father, more than his grandfather. The Brisker Rav, when he was ill, he asked Rav Shach to go up. Rav Shach was very close to the Brisker Rav. He asked Rav Shach to go to Meron to daven for him. And for the Brisker Rav to say that, that's a highly, highly unusual thing. So there is something very special about the Kivrei Tzadikim in Meron. Yeah.
Regarding Rav Moshe's first tshuva, his reading of the Shulchan Aruch seems very literalist rather than intentionalist. Doesn't that assume that the Shulchan Aruch has like some kind of semi-spiritual divine level? Like even though the Mechaber didn't intend the words this way because they were written like this, then we should interpret it like this.
Well, I mean, you're presupposing a conclusion. I think Rav Moshe's argument is that Rav Yosef Karo was very exacting in his choice of words, and I mean, just compare it. Look at the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Avelos in Yoredeya, and look at the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Sfiras HaOmer in Orach Chaim. In Yoredeya, it says, Ein nichnasin lebeis hamishteh. In Sfiras HaOmer, it says, Ein nosin nashim. Right? So, I mean, I don't think Rav Moshe is at fault for assuming that the Shulchan Aruch was medayek, was exact in the words that the Shulchan Aruch chose to use, right? And that's Rav Moshe's diak. The problem is, I mean, you're raising a conceptual question, and that is, if the practices of Sfira are supposed to be modeled on Avelos, why should there be this discrepancy? I mean, you could ask conceptually. I mean, isn't Sfira supposed to be modeled on the laws of mourning? And yet Rav Moshe is making a distinction in those laws. Yeah.
What's the earliest source for the latter two Magim of what is the Mi'agola and it's not that
the Magen Avram brings it. I don't think he was the first. I mean, he's not the first source. The Magen Avram does not create minhagim, but the Magen Avram already brings those minhagim of Rosh Chodesh and the like. People sometimes ask, what is the minhag of? You have to follow the minhag of your city, your community. So, what is the minhag of Yerushalayim? What is the minhag of Borough Park? What's the minhag of New York? So the truth is, the poskim have said, and this is an interesting point, the notion of the minhag of a kehila, the minhag of a city at least, is something that's more or less extinct today, because we have every major city has Yidden from all over the place. Ashkenazim, Sfardim, Taimanim, you have Yekis and Polish and Iraqis and Moroccans. So it's not shaykh. This is what is called Ir. In fact, you said by Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is called Ir Mikuta'as. Ir Mikuta'as means a cut-up city, a city made of many pieces. So it's not shaykh to talk about the minhag of Yerushalayim, the minhag of Bnei Brak. However, within given edus, within given communities, there may be minhagim. There'll be a minhag of Chabad, which happens to follow the Arizal of 49 days. There may be Yekashim minhagim, right? So one could try to find out what those different minhagim are. But the notion of mokim, the notion that a place has a minhag, is not really that true today, because we forget what the communal structure was like in Europe. In Europe, there was relatively little mobility. People stayed put for hundreds and hundreds of years in Frankfurt or whatever it would be. So there was a minhag of Frankfurt and a minhag of this city and a minhag of that city. But already in the late Middle Ages there began to be a lot of migration back and forth. So the notion, in fact, Rav Avadja has a famous psak. Rav Avadja actually says, he claims that the minhag of Eretz Yisrael was to be Makabel Rav Yosef Karo, the Mechaber, as the Mora Da'asra, the official posek of Eretz Yisrael. And he says this was the minhag of Eretz Yisrael. So he said, when Ashkenazim came to Eretz Yisrael in larger numbers in the 19th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, they had no heter to follow the Ramah or the Gra, or whatever they followed, because they came as a minority, and when a minority comes to a majority, they are mechuyev to follow the minhagim of the majority. And even if it's now the case that Ashkenazim might be a majority, but this is called kama kama batal. Kama kama batal means as each small group comes in, they become nullified to the larger group. So Ovadia says, even Ashkenazim are not allowed to follow the Ramah in Eretz Yisrael. They're mechuyev to follow Rav Yosef Karo, but Rav Ovadia says, I can't control the Ashkenazim, so they'll do what they do. But he was emphasizing, Rav Ovadia had a whole thing because there were groups of Sephardim, Moroccans, I had mentioned, that either followed Psukim like the Ramah or followed the Ben Ish Chai. In fact, Ben Ish Chai was a great gadol from Iraq, from Bavel, at the beginning of the 20th century. Ben Ish Chai, again, in the Sephardic world, is kind of like the Vilna Gaon. Really tremendous up there. So, but the Ben Ish Chai, Al Pi Kabbalah and the like, often does not follow Rav Yosef Karo. So I remember, and the Iraqis follow the Ben Ish Chai. Ben Ish Chai. So what was the story? So when Rav Ovadia was a single boy, he was only 16 years old. So he used to give a shir between Mincha and Ma'ariv to the Balabatim in Musiyaf, right? And Rechov Yecheskel, Bukharim, show working people, simple people. And between Mincha and Ma'ariv, there would be like a 20-minute class, like Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, in the Ben Ish Chai. So Rav Ovadia is 16 years old. He's reading Ben Ish Chai, which is to them like the Chumash, And and he would just say, he would say, 16 years old, he would just say, Ben Ish Chai is wrong here because Rav Yosef Karo says so-and-so, and we don't listen to this one. So he says he almost got lynched. They were going to kill him. The 16-year-old kid is saying the Ben Ish Chai, don't follow the Ben Ish Chai. So his Rosh Hashiva, Rav Ezra Atzia, the Rosh Hashiva Parat Yosef, who was Rav Ovadia's Rebbe, had to come in and get him not police protection, but get him protection, escort him out, and said, listen, when you teach Ben Ish Chai, just read the Ben Ish Chai. Don't add your commentary to the Ben Ish Chai. Now Rav Ovadia did write Sfarim. Besides his famous Sfarim, he wrote a Sfarim on the Ben Ish Chai, in which he goes through. What's called Halichas Olam? Yeah, in which he goes through the Ben Ish Chai and he shows the different places where you don't paskin. So Rav Ovadia was really a chassid of Rav Yosef Karo in that way. He said any Sephardim who don't follow are totally wrong, and Ashkenazim even we're not allowed to follow in Eretz Yisrael because Rav Yosef Karo became the Mora Diasra. Okay, so but nevertheless. The consensus is each kehila can have its own minhagim. We don't consider it to be a binding minhag hamakam. And Yerushalayim is called Ir Makutas, an ear of many minhagim. And that is why we cannot say there's a dominant minhag here. But be it as it may, these are two tshuvas of Rav Moshe that are kedai to be aware of. Okay. Alrighty, now, and I'm going to backtrack on a different topic, and that is, we know Sfiras Omer is a mitzvah to count days, and we count from the day that the Omer is brought. And that's why Tosas and Menachos says, when you don't have a Beis HaMikdash, the counting of the Omer is midrabanan, because there is no Korban HaOmer. What is the Korban HaOmer exactly? The Korban HaOmer is a mincha. That means it's a meal offering, number one. Number two, it is barley flour, which is very unique. Barley flour mixed with oil. A 3 fingers full, called kamitza, is taken off the mixed flour and oil, burnt on the mizbeach. The rest of the barley flour is baked as matzah. By the way, not because it's Pesach, although that's also a reason. All menachos are generally baked as matzah. In other words, keep in mind that the Beis HaMikdash is largely a chametz-free zone the whole year, and whenever menachos are eaten, even in the middle of the year, they will typically be eaten in an unleavened state, and the like. Now, what is the purpose of the Korban HaOmer? So the Korban HaOmer has a very, very specific purpose, and that is, it takes off an Iser in the Torah that is called Chadash. New grain, and we'll talk about the definition of that, new grain cannot be eaten at all until the Korban HaOmer is brought. Once the Korban HaOmer is brought, we are now allowed to eat the new grain, or to put it another way, the chadash now becomes yashan. I mentioned, I think last week, that bisman hazeh, when there is no korban omer, new grain cannot be eaten until the 16th of Nisan passes. So instead of the korban, it is the day that matters. When there's a Beis HaMikdash, it is the korban that matters, chadash. When there's no Beis HaMikdash, it is the day that matters. And how we know this from a drasha, basically, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. So now I just want to clarify this a little bit. What do we mean by new grain and old grain? This I don't know if we spoke about. What is chadash? What is yashan? What makes something new? What makes something old? So there's a very, very precise definition. Any grain that took root before the Omer date, even though it didn't grow and it wasn't harvested till later, is grain that the Omer matters. But grain that didn't take root until afterwards is new grain that's not going to be mutter until next Omer. So, an example. Let's imagine I planted wheat in the month of Adar. So by the time the 16th of Nisan comes, this wheat has already taken root, even if nothing is visible above ground. And then after Pesach, it grows, and I eventually harvest it in the summer. I can eat that grain right away, because since that grain was already rooted, when the Omer date or the Omer korban was brought, that's called, well, it was called chadash until the Omer date, and now it's called yashan, old grain. Now, if on the other hand I planted grain after Pesach, that grain is not going to be permitted until the next Omer date. Okay, so it all depends on what is called hashrasha. Hashrasha is taking root. Anything that took root, or later, I mean, obviously if you have harvested grain, in other words, anything that took root or is even later than that, such as being harvested, before the Omer date, will be mutter with the Omer date. That which didn't take root until after the Omer date, which basically means it was planted after the Omer date, is not going to be mutter till the next Omer date, because by the next Omer date, it took root before that date. I mean, everything will take root before some Omer date, either this one or that one. Okay? Now, which means essentially like this. Today, we don't have the Korban Omer, so the laws of Chadash depend totally on the Omer date, which is the 16th of Nisan. Right? So if it was Hishrish before the 16th of Nisan, it's mutter afterwards. If it was not Hishrish until after the 16th of Nisan, it's not going to be mutter till next 16th of Nisan. Okay? That's the laws of Chadash. Today, again, we don't have the Korban Omer, it's only totally on the Omer date. Now, the Isser of Chadash 100% applies to Eretz Yisrael grain. There is no question whatsoever. It is 100% here. Does the Isser of Chadash apply in Chutz La'aretz grain? That's a huge machlokas poskim. Rov poskim actually say there is an Isser of Chadash, even in Chutz La'aretz. However, for various reasons, which I'll say for maybe tomorrow, the Ramah is Mekel. That's why, for example, hashgachos like the OU, which you might call mainstream hashgachos, do not certify whether something is chadash or not chadash. They will put an OU on products that are technically chadash in Chutz La'aretz on the smach that the Ramah says that we are Mekel and the Yisr of Chadash and Chutz La'aretz. The more Mahadrin Hashgachas, particularly Hasidish Hashgachas, they do certify that this is Yashan or whatever. Now remember, keep in mind, anything that's Chadash will become Yashan eventually. In other words, you buy up cookies that are Chadash, they will be mutter after next Pesach, so people sometimes store it up. Now, here's the thing, in fact, there's even a guide, you can get it online, Lakewood publishes product guides about what's chadash, what's not chadash, based on product codes, computer codes, because on any food package of any processed food, whether it's macaroni, cookies, or the like, it'll tell you like when was it harvested and the like, and if you study that information, you could figure it out. Now, a moment reflection should tell you though, and I'm going to be very approximate, that between Pesach and Sukkot, approximation I'm talking about, there is fundamentally no problem of chadash. Because any grain product, cookies, cake, bread, spaghetti, remember chadash is only the 5 grains, not vegetables or fruit, only the 5 grains. Any wheat product that comes our way now must have been planted before Pesach. So as a result, it was already hishrish before the Omer, it's going to be mutter. So I'm being very approximate. You have to check dates if you want to be machmer in this. But basically, Pesach to Sukkot is a chadash-free zone. Where chadash begins to be a problem is after Sukkot. Again, I'm being very approximate. Because after Sukkot, you will already have grain products that were planted after Pesach that technically will not be mutter till next Chadash, the next Omer date. So what people who keep Yashan do is that between Pesach and Sukkot, they buy all of the cookies, spaghetti, pasta that they want to have the whole year, right? So they have it in their basement, and therefore they know that this is going to be good. This is clearly not Chadash. Okay? So they do their purchasing between Pesach and Sukkot, and that will cover them for the whole year, because the Chadash problem only materializes after Sukkot. Everyone understands why. Because anything that was hishrish before Pesach is going to be mutter with the Omer date, and nothing goes to market until around Sukkot that has not already been hushrash before Pesach. Okay, so, but again, this is an issue that has to worry you only in Chutz La'aretz if you want to be machmer on it. In Eretz Yisrael, you do not have to worry, because any reliable hashgacha that certifies the product is certifying to you that this is not a chadash product. So, paradoxically, in Eretz Yisrael, where the Yisr of chadash is stronger, you can actually be more lenient on a hashgacha, because the hashgacha is certifying that this is not chadash, as opposed to the United States, where the mainstream hashgachas do not certify that. But if you want to be machmer, you're going to have to kind of buy things during this free time. Okay? Again, I don't want to get anybody anxious, meaning you can go to a store the whole year, buy something with a reliable hashgacha, it will not be chadash here. But if it's a Chutz La'aretz product, it might be. Okay, supper.